My greedy uncle demanded I sell my parents' house and split the money with him, claiming he deserved compensation for raising my dad. When I refused, he hired a fake lawyer and stood in my living room yelling, "You'll be homeless soon!" But when my actual lawyer walked in with a court order, his face went pale as I calmly stated, "Actually, you're the one who's trespassing." My parents died a year apart. First my dad from lung cancer, then my mom from a heart attack 8 months later. It was hard. I was the one who handled everything: hospital visits, home hospice, funeral planning, and all the estate stuff. I was also the one who stayed in the house to take care of them while my siblings handled their own lives out of state. My parents lived in a small colonial-style home in Scranton, Pennsylvania. They paid off the mortgage years ago. The house isn't fancy, but it's solid and full of memories. My mom cooked in that kitchen for decades. My dad built half the shelves in the garage with his own hands. It's the kind of place that feels alive even when it's quiet. Their will was clear. The house was left to me. I was the only one living there, and I had given up my job to care for them during their final years. In return, my siblings got other items of value: retirement savings, insurance payouts, etc., and they were totally fine with it. There was no argument. But then came Rick. Rick is my dad's older half-brother. Same father, different mothers. He wasn't close to us. I hadn't seen him since I was maybe 15. He lived in Newark, New Jersey, and never showed up for anything: birthdays, graduations, weddings, funerals. Total ghost. He wasn't around when my parents were sick. Didn't call. Didn't send a single text or card. Not even after they passed. Then, one day out of nowhere, he just appeared. No warning. I was in the front yard raking leaves when this beat-up Ford Taurus pulled up. Rick stepped out, wearing sunglasses and a wrinkled blazer like he was some kind of big shot. "Hey, kiddo," he said. "Long time." I just stared at him. Didn't even respond. Then he walked up and said, "Let's talk about the house." Rick started going off about how he raised my dad when they were younger. How their father, my grandfather, wasn't around much, and he had to step in. "I was basically his parent," he said. "Fed him, kept him out of trouble. You wouldn't have this house if it weren't for me." Then he pulled out some papers from his inside pocket and waved them around like they were legal documents. "I think it's only fair we sell the place and split it. You can't just take everything." "I'm owed something." I asked him, straight-faced. "You think you're owed half this house?" "Exactly. Compensation," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "For everything I did for your father growing up. Emotional support. Food. School clothes. That stuff adds up." I told him there was a will. The house was left to me, and the will was already probated and filed. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Well, we'll see what the court has to say. You'll be hearing from my lawyer soon." He turned, got into his car, and drove off. A week later, I get this thick envelope in the mail. Inside is a letter with a made-up legal header like, "Law Offices of James K. Watterson and Association." It said Rick was pursuing inheritance compensation and demanding we initiate the sale of the property within 30 days or face formal litigation. It looked official at a glance, but something felt off. No address for the law firm. No phone number. Just an AOL email, "I'm serious." And the language was weird, like it had been copied from a legal template online. I contacted our family lawyer, Hannah, who handled my parents' estate. She took one look at it and said, "This isn't a real law firm. It's probably a friend of his or something he made up." We both agreed to play it cool and watch his next move. Over the next few weeks, I heard from neighbors that Rick had come around a few times when I wasn't home. One said he even told her the house was his, and I was just borrowing it for now. Another said he asked if I was planning to move out soon. I started locking everything up. I also put up 2 small outdoor cameras, just in case. Meanwhile, Hannah started gathering documents in case we needed to push back legally. The will was solid. We had the court's probate confirmation, plus bank records, medical records, and statements from people who knew what I'd done for my parents those final years. There was no way Rick could win anything in court. But Rick didn't want to go to court. He wanted to scare me into giving him the house. One Saturday afternoon, I was inside fixing the broken kitchen sink valve when I heard loud yelling from the front yard. Not talking, yelling. I stepped outside and saw Rick standing right in the middle of my lawn with a clipboard, waving it in the air and shouting, "This house belongs to me. I own this property. She's squatting. You'll be homeless soon." He had 2 men with him, one older, one younger, both looking confused. One of them asked me if I was the homeowner. I said yes. He looked at Rick and said, "I thought you said this was abandoned." Rick turned red and shouted, "You're trespassing on my inheritance!" I pulled out my phone and started recording. "This is private property," I said. "You need to leave." That's when he yelled again, "The court's on my side! You're done! This is my house now!" And then, perfect timing, Hannah pulled into the driveway. Hannah stepped out with a thick binder and a manila envelope. She calmly walked up and asked what was going on. Rick started shouting again, this time a little less confident. "She's squatting in my property! There's a legal claim, ask my lawyer," Hannah said. "Your lawyer doesn't exist. You've sent fake legal documents. You've intimidated my client. That ends today." Then she pulled out a printed court order from probate. "This home is legally owned by my client. You have no standing, no interest, and no authority to be here." Rick's face went completely pale. She continued, "You are trespassing. I strongly suggest you leave before we file harassment charges." "And yes, we will." He tried to argue, but it was weak, just stammering and hand-waving. The other two men looked uncomfortable and started walking away. One of them whispered something to Rick, then shook his head and left. Rick looked at me. "You think this is over?" I said nothing. He walked off the property, got in his car, and drove away again. But I knew he'd be back. That was just round one. About a week later, it was just past 10 p.m. I was half asleep watching TV in the living room when I saw the porch motion light flicker on through the curtains. I grabbed my phone and walked over slowly. When I peeked through the peephole, I saw someone standing at the edge of the yard. It was Rick. He wasn't alone. This time, he had someone else with him. A younger guy in a black hoodie, pacing around with a flashlight. I quietly hit record on my phone and turned off the lights. Rick walked up to the door, didn't knock, just looked straight at it, then started talking loud enough for me to hear. "You've got 48 hours to move out. This is your last warning." The guy with the flashlight was walking around the side of the house now. I could hear him trying the gate. I stayed behind the door, heart racing. I live alone. I didn't know what these guys were capable of. I didn't want to confront them directly, not without backup. So I called the police. They came faster than I expected. Maybe because I used the phrase, "possible attempted break-in." Or maybe because it was just a quiet night. 2 patrol cars rolled up within 10 minutes. The blue and red lights lit up the street. Rick and the other guy tried to act innocent. "We were just here to talk," he said over and over. The officer told them they were trespassing and asked for IDs. The young guy didn't want to give his, but eventually did. Rick kept running his mouth. "She's a fraud. She's living in my house. You don't know what she's done. This is family business." Then I stepped outside, with Hannah's court order in my hand. I was shaking, but I held it up. "This is a legally probated will. The house is mine. He's harassing me and he brought someone onto my property in the dark." The police took one look at the paperwork, then pulled Rick aside and told him if he came back, he'd be arrested. They let him go that night but logged a report. I installed a second set of cameras the next day. One in the backyard, one near the garage. I also changed every lock on the house. I couldn't sleep right for the next week. A few days later, I was going through some of my mom's old things in the upstairs closet. She kept notebooks, receipts, greeting cards, all that sentimental stuff. But then I found a manila folder I had never seen before. It was labeled Rick/Loan Docs. Inside was a stack of handwritten notes, some dating back decades. My mom had written down every time Rick had borrowed money. Every check she or my dad had written him. Every time he said he'd pay them back, next month, and didn't. Thousands of dollars over the years. Car repairs, late rent, help with bills. Every time he showed up needing something, they helped. One note even said, "Rick said if we help him pay the hospital bill, he'll sign a release form giving up any inheritance claims." That note was dated 2004. And taped to the back of the folder was the signed form. Not notarized, but signed. By Rick. His full name and a copy of his old driver's license stapled to the corner. I felt this chill go down my spine. My parents knew this might happen. They knew. They had been documenting it for years. I called Hannah right away. She came over and we went through the folder together. "This changes everything," she said. But that same week, she called me again, this time with bad news. "Rick filed something with the county," she said. "It's not valid, but it's dangerous. He tried to file a lien against your property. Now I don't know much about real estate law, but a lien basically says someone has a financial claim on your property. Even if it's fake, it can cause a lot of problems, especially if you try to refinance or sell. He claimed he was owed back inheritance, and that I was withholding family assets. Total lies. Hannah filed a motion to have it removed immediately. But even then, the damage was already happening. I started getting strange mail. Ads for home investors. Random realtors leaving flyers. Even one sketchy letter saying, "We heard you're looking to sell fast." That's when I realized Rick was shopping the fake lien around like it was real. Telling people I was in the process of transferring the deed. Probably hoping someone would bite and he could squeeze money out of them. I was furious. I stopped answering the door for anyone I didn't recognize. I barely left the house for a week. Then my cousin, Rick's daughter, let's call her Melissa, called me out of nowhere. She apologized. "Look," she said, "I don't want to get in the middle of this, but my dad's saying a lot of weird stuff. He's telling people he's suing you for the house. He said you're squatting and that you forged the will." I told her everything. The will. The police. The lien. The fake lawyer. She sighed. "That sounds like him. I'm so sorry. He did this to our uncle years ago, too. Tried to take over his house when he was in hospice." That piece of information hit me like a punch in the stomach. Rick wasn't just a greedy old man. He was a pattern. She ended the call by saying, "Please don't hate me because of him. I'll talk to him, but I doubt it'll help." The next twist came out of nowhere. I got a knock on the door around 9 a.m. on a Wednesday. It was a woman holding a clipboard. "Hi," she said, polite smile. "I'm here to inspect the property for appraisal." I blinked. "For what?" "Your uncle said this property is in escrow. I'm with a third-party buyer doing a walkthrough for closing purposes." I just stared at her. "You were told this house is in escrow?" "Yes," she said, flipping through her papers. "Said the sale was in final stages. That you were moving out by the end of the month." I pulled out my phone. Again. "Can you repeat who sent you?" She did. Rick's full name. And the name of the buyer, someone I'd never heard of. I showed her the court documents. Told her the house wasn't for sale. That I was the legal owner. That there was a restraining order pending against Rick. She looked uncomfortable. Apologized. Said she was just doing what she was told. She left. But now I knew. Rick was trying to sell my house. Without my consent. Without any legal authority. He was pretending he owned it. And he wasn't done yet. Hannah and I had a long talk. She recommended hiring a private investigator. "It's not just about your house anymore," she said. "If he's pulling this kind of stunt with you, chances are he's done it before." So we brought in a guy named Ken. Retired NYPD, now in private work. No nonsense, quiet, but sharp as hell. He took copies of the documents we had, including the signed release of inheritance claim from 2004, and started digging. Within a week, he came back with a folder thicker than I expected. Rick had a pattern, just like my cousin Melissa hinted. Over the past 15 years, Rick had involved himself in 3 other estate battles, each time with distant relatives or ex-partners who had passed away. Every time, he tried to insert himself into the wills or estate claims. One of them was an aunt in Atlantic City who had dementia. Rick showed up at the hospital after she passed and claimed to be her closest living relative, trying to take over her condo. He was eventually thrown out of probate court when the real executor showed up with notarized documents. Another case involved an old friend of his who died suddenly. Rick filed a bogus claim of co-ownership on a storage unit that ended up containing thousands in vintage collectibles. Nothing had ever stuck, but he always walked away with something, a settlement, a cash buyout just to make him go away, or stolen property no one bothered to track. Ken also found something else. In a folder submitted with the fake lien paperwork Rick filed, there was a document titled Quitclaim Deed Transfer. Basically, it was a form someone would use to sign over property rights. Only problem? The signature on that form was mine. Except I never signed it. It was a forgery. Hannah compared it to my known signature from the will. Totally different strokes, spacing, and flow. She brought in a document examiner to confirm it. The expert said it was clearly traced or digitally replicated. Rick had forged my name on a legal property document and submitted it to the county as part of his scheme to list the house for sale. That changed everything. Now we weren't just dealing with harassment or trespassing. We were dealing with fraud. Then came the weirdest part yet. Remember the buyer, the appraiser mentioned? The one who was supposedly about to buy my house. Well, I started getting calls from a blocked number. I ignored them at first. Then I got a voicemail. "Hi, this is regarding the property on address. We're still moving forward with closing. If you're not out by the 28th, there will be legal consequences. I called Hannah. She told me to save the voicemail, then traced the number through some contacts she had. The buyer turned out to be a small-time flipper based out of Jersey. Name was Tony G. Apparently, Rick had promised to sell him the house for cheap, as long as Tony paid cash under the table and moved fast. Tony was under the impression Rick owned the house. Ken found out that Rick even gave him a fake set of keys, copied from when Rick used to visit my parents back in the day, before they changed the locks. Keys that no longer worked, but were enough to make the whole thing look legit. Tony wasn't just mad when he learned the truth, he was terrified. Apparently, this wasn't his first time getting caught in shady deals. He immediately cut ties and sent me a formal withdrawal letter. In case anything gets pursued. I turned it over to Hannah. The forgery, combined with the fake sale, had crossed a major line. Hannah made one thing clear. Now we can take this to the DA. The night after we confronted Tony's involvement, Rick called me directly for the first time in months. He must have sensed the walls closing in. Hey, he said like we were pals. Listen. This has all gotten out of hand. I didn't say anything. I let him talk. I think we should just talk this out. No need for lawyers or police. I mean, come on, this is family. I'll back off. We can split the sale and move on. Everyone wins. I finally spoke. You forged my signature. Silence. I have a copy of it. And a handwriting analysis. And a police report about your break-in attempt. And proof you tried to scam a buyer. Still nothing. Then weakly. That was just business. You don't have to make it personal. I hung up. Last week, Hannah handed over everything to the local district attorney in Lackawanna County. Rick's fraudulent lien filing. The forged deed. The voicemail. The private investigator's report. We were told they're reviewing it for potential criminal charges, fraud, forgery, attempted theft, and more. I was told not to have contact with Rick anymore. So I haven't. But I've heard things. Melissa called again. She sounded panicked. I don't know what he's thinking, she said. He's packing up like he's leaving town. I think he knows he's going to get arrested. Then she said something I didn't expect. He mentioned he might try to flip the story. Said he could prove you stole his inheritance. That the will was fake. Apparently, he's been showing people a second will. One that names him as the rightful heir. It's obviously a forgery. My parents never trusted Rick. But now he's claiming my documents are fake and his are the original copy. It's only a matter of time before he tries to submit this forged will to the court. Hannah and I are preparing for it. And the DA? They're watching closely. After we found out Rick had forged not only my signature but a second will naming himself as heir, I stopped sleeping properly. Even though I knew it was fake, even though I had legal backup, something about this man's audacity, his need to lie, twist, and scam, kept me on edge. Then the DA called. They were ready. A court date was set, both to clear my name and to address the criminal complaints. Rick was summoned. This wasn't going to be a civil conversation anymore. This was court. The courtroom wasn't dramatic like you see in movies. It was quiet, cold, and smelled like disinfectant and paper. I sat at one table with Hannah. Rick sat at the other alone. No lawyer showed up for him. He was wearing a suit I'm pretty sure he borrowed or pulled out of a thrift shop. His hair looked like he'd combed it in the car. He looked nervous. Hannah started by calmly laying out everything. My parents' original will, the signed and notarized court record, the forged deed with the document examiner's report, the attempted sale, the voicemail, the folder of my parents' loan records showing how often Rick had asked for help, and finally, the copy of the alternate will he tried to file, with signatures that didn't match, witnesses who didn't exist, and a notarization stamp that was proven to be fabricated. Then came the breaking point. When Hannah finished, the judge looked at Rick and said, "Do you have anything to say before I make a ruling on this matter?" Rick stood. Hand shaking. Voice low at first. "I raised that boy," he said. "I raised his father. I gave him food when their dad was drunk. I helped him with school. I was the older brother and the parent. That house, it's partly mine, even if the law doesn't say it is." Then louder, angrier. "I was owed. Nobody looked after me. Nobody gave me anything." I looked at him. This man had torn my family's peace apart over nothing real. Just resentment. So I stood up. I wasn't supposed to, but I asked the judge if I could say something. He allowed it. I looked at Rick and I said, "You were never part of my life. You ignored every phone call when they were dying. You didn't visit. You didn't care. And now you want to say you're owed something? You forged my name. You lied to people. You tried to sell the house behind my back. Rick opened his mouth to respond, but I kept going. I cleaned blood out of the carpet after my dad fell trying to get to the bathroom. I held my mom's hand when she couldn't breathe. Where were you then? The courtroom went still. Even the court officer leaned in. Rick started to cry. Not sobbing. Just quiet, bitter tears. I had nothing, he said. You don't understand. They never gave me anything. I thought, if I just got a piece, I could finally feel like I belong. The judge cut in. Belonging is not something you get through fraud. The judge ruled that Rick had committed multiple violations. The forged documents were turned over to the DA's office. A formal restraining order was issued. He was banned from stepping within 500 feet of me or the property. An arrest warrant was filed the same day, for fraud, forgery, and attempted theft of real estate. Charges pending. His bail was posted by his daughter, Melissa. She was in the courtroom. Quiet the whole time. After the hearing, she came up to me in the hallway. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't know how bad it had gotten. I should have said something sooner. I nodded. We didn't hug. But we understood each other. She walked away, and I haven't heard from her since. Rick tried to claim afterward that he was set up. He told a local paper he was disrespected and shut out of family inheritance. They didn't publish the piece. The DA's office told us the case would likely result in a plea deal. He'd avoid jail but be on probation for a long time. His credit was destroyed. The county flagged him for fraud. He lost his apartment and moved in with a distant cousin. As for me, I had a breakdown the night after the hearing. I cried in the hallway of my house for 2 straight hours. The stress, the fear, the rage. It all came out. It felt like my parents had died again, because their memory, their will, their love, had been turned into a battlefield. My neighbors started stopping by more often after that. One brought cookies. Another mowed the lawn without asking. Word had gotten around. I learned something I didn't want to learn. Not everyone you share blood with is family. Some people will burn your world down for a piece of something they didn't build, didn't nurture, didn't earn. I also learned this: documentation saves you. Silence doesn't. If I hadn't saved the will, if I hadn't hired a lawyer, if I hadn't stood up and said no, Rick might have won. He almost did. Now, the house is quiet again. The air feels clean. And sometimes, when I sit on the porch with a coffee in the early morning, I feel like my parents are still here. Not physically, but in the peace. The stillness. I don't know if I'm hopeful yet. But I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done. And for the first time since they passed, I can finally breathe in this house without feeling like I'm under attack. That's enough for now.